All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Aatif Rashid's book club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing The Great Gatsby. Now, to be honest, the problem with Gatsby is that it's so iconic of a novel, and it's such a cultural presence that it has a life of its own outside the text. People know Gatsby, or they think they know Gatsby. There's the movie, obviously, with Leonardo DiCaprio, which has this influence on the internet in the form of memes and shared images. But there's also just the general cultural phenomenon of the nostalgia for the 1920s that gets associated with Gatsby. But on this podcast, I'm less interested in books as cultural phenomena and more in the texts themselves. So in our discussion of Gatsby, I want to stay focused on the text itself, on Fitzgerald's words, on Fitzgerald's language, on the way that he structured this, quite frankly, this work of genius, which I do believe Gatsby is a work of genius. I think that it is an American fable on par with the Greek tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles. It is our version of those kinds of tragedies. As we talk about Gatsby today, I'm also going to try and avoid quoting the most famous passages from the book. There are obviously a lot of very famous passages that get quoted a lot. We're going to talk about the ending. That's a very famous passage. Obviously, it's impossible to talk about why Gatsby works without that beautiful, breathtaking ending. But there are other passages that I want to focus on, and I think So the common understanding of Gatsby, the way it's often taught in schools, is that Nick Carraway, our narrator, is an observer. And I actually believe that is a misguided way of looking at Gatsby. When you look at the structure of Gatsby, it is clear that Nick, although he is very passive, although much of the plot of the novel hinges on Gatsby, Nick himself is a protagonist in the traditional sense because he experiences a character arc over the course of the novel. Essentially, his friendship with Gatsby, the influence that Gatsby has on him, profoundly changes who Nick is and changes his relationship with New York City, with capitalism, you could argue, with money, with America more generally. And so Nick does undergo a traditional character arc. And what I want to do in this discussion is basically look at different passages that show and trace Nick's character arc, because I think it's really that character arc that defines the structure and shape of Gatsby. You know, Gatsby himself, obviously the title character, an essential character, but he is also a sort of larger-than-life figure who we, as readers, cannot really connect with. No, the truth is the character that we are meant to identify with, and the character that I think Fitzgerald wants us to connect with, is Nick Carraway. One of the things we're going to talk about a lot in this novel is audience identification. And just like how, a few weeks ago when we talked about The Crying of Lot 49, we talked about how Pynchon does an excellent job of getting us to identify with Oedipa, and how the point of the novel is the audience undergoes a similar experience to the one that Oedipa undergoes. I think the same thing is true here. The audience experiences the novel as Nick experiences the novel. And so that's why I think he is actually, in some ways, the more important character than Gatsby. I want to start with, so in chapter 1, right, the primary conflict of the novel that's set up is Nick visits his cousin Daisy Buchanan, and during this dinner party, right, at Daisy and her husband Tom's estate on Long Island, he basically learns that Daisy is deeply, deeply unhappy. And Fitzgerald does an excellent job of conveying this through subtext. So I think Daisy often gets unfairly maligned by critics of the novel. People think she's shallow and materialistic, but I think it's hard to read this opening scene and not feel profound sympathy for Daisy, because that's what Nick feels. He feels profound sympathy for Daisy after this evening at their house. But in order to do that, you have to be able to read the subtext. So I want to read this exchange of dialogue between Daisy and Nick, And I want us to sort of think about the subtext of what's going on here. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While, trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true." She hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything." Now, you have to remember, up to this point, we have seen Daisy interacting with Tom, interacting with Jordan over sort of the meal in a slightly frivolous, almost silly way. We sort of wonder, is Daisy even really that intelligent? She seems kind of dumb. But here, the mask drops. So in this scene, her mask drops, and we see that she's actually pretty smart, and that she's aware of the suffering, basically, that she's experiencing in her marriage. She's aware that Tom is not a good husband, that his views on race are problematic, to say the least, and that he's obviously keeping a mistress and not even hiding her very well. And once we see the mask drop, I think it endears us as readers to Daisy a lot more, just as it endears Nick to Daisy a lot more. He realizes that the perception of her that he had at the beginning of this dinner party is not true, is not correct, that she's actually aware of things in a way that he might not have realized. So continuing the conversation, evidently she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh, yes." She looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. 'All right,' I said. 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool.' You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated." The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort, to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. So that section kind of ends with Nick reflecting on this idea of like wealth disparity, wealth difference, this feeling that Daisy is sort of part of a world that he's a little bit distant from. But also notice how he emphasizes he recognizes the insincerity of what she says when she talks about being sophisticated, when she says the best thing a girl can be in this world is a beautiful little fool. What Nick is essentially recognizing in Daisy's tone of voice is irony. He realizes that she is being ironic in the way she's talking about her daughter, and by extension herself. Essentially, in this scene, we see that Daisy is smart enough to recognize that she has to put on a performance as Tom's wife. She has to play the part of a beautiful fool who pretends to be sophisticated, when obviously, in reality, she's suffering pretty deeply. And so this scene is the first, I suppose you could say, introduction of conflict and tension. Nick sees that Daisy and her husband Tom don't really have a great marriage. And later, right, when Nick is going to meet Gatsby himself, it's going to fit right in, right? Daisy has this opportunity then to escape from Tom into this old relationship with Gatsby. And obviously, things don't go very well. But what we're setting up here at the beginning of the novel, at least, is this idea of Daisy's unhappiness. So moving on, the next section that I want to focus on, right? I want to kind of jump ahead. I'm actually going to skip the chapter where Nick meets Gatsby. That chapter has been analyzed to death. And obviously, it's essential for the plot. It's the dynamics of the novel. But I'm interested, again, in Nick as a character. Nick's emotional arc in the novel. And so I want actually to take a look at, there's a scene right after he meets Gatsby, chapter 3, right? Right after the party where he meets Gatsby, where he kind of describes in a general sense his life in New York. And I want to just look at some of the descriptions here, because I think this section has some of Fitzgerald's best writing, the kind of atmospheric, lyrical, beautiful writing that he's known for. So, most of the time I worked. In the early morning, the sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasms of lower New York to the Probity Trust. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names and lunched with them in dark, crowded restaurants on little pig sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I even had a short affair with a girl who lived in Jersey City and worked in the accounting department, but her brother began throwing mean looks in my direction, so when she went on her vacation in July, I let it blow quietly away. I took dinner, usually, at the Yale Club. For some reason, it was the gloomiest event of my day. And then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for a conscientious hour. There were generally a few rioters around, but they never came into the library, so it was a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue, past the old Murray Hill Hotel, and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. So let's pause there for a moment. What we're describing is Nick's life in New York. Notice how it's not very exciting, is it? Right? As he says, he has similar routine pretty much every day. The descriptions that he gives of New York, the white chasms of lower New York, not exactly the kind of glamorous New York of the 1920s. No, he is different from what he calls the rioters, right? Rioters there just means like partiers, partygoers, people like Gatsby. Nick is different from them. He spends his time in dark, crowded restaurants eating little pig sausages, right? Even his romances are not real romances. They're just these sort of passionless simulations of romance. So it's a very gloomy life he's describing. He studies investments. He has the same, the word he uses is conscientious. The next paragraph, we're going to see that despite this life, Nick now seems to desire something more. And you have to remember, this comes after he has just met Gatsby at this glamorous party. And so suddenly his life in New York is no longer going to feel fulfilling for him, no longer going to feel exciting for him. So the next paragraph, I began to like New York, the racy, adventurous feel of it at night, and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eye. I liked to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd, and imagine that in a few minutes I was going to enter into their lives, and no one would ever know or disapprove. Sometimes, in my mind, I followed them to their apartments on the corners of hidden streets, and they turned and smiled back at me before they faded through a door into warm darkness. At the enchanted metropolitan twilight, I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others, poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows, waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner. Young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. This is a brilliant passage of writing because this is something I talk about in my creative writing classes all the time. What Fitzgerald does so well here when he's describing the setting was several things, right? So first, he picks very specific images to create this visual of New York, right? So, and in particular, there's kind of two big images here that he focuses on. One, the romantic women that Nick picks out from the crowd and kind of follows back in the darkness. And kind of a slightly unsettling image of almost like voyeurism, stalking almost, right? Which really characterizes how Nick approaches the idea of romance. He is not like Gatsby. He is lonely. He is isolated. He is hesitant. All he can do is sort of follow them and imagine things in his head. And the second image is, of course, the young clerks loitering in front of windows, waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner. I always remember this image. This is one of those images that has stuck in my head ever since I first read this in high school. Just the idea of a young man working as a clerk, kind of eating dinner alone. And to Nick, and by extension I think to Fitzgerald, this is one of the saddest images in the novel because, as he says, these are young clerks. They're not old men, they're not middle-aged men, they're young men. And yet they are wasting their youth. They are wasting, as he says, the most poignant moments of night and life because they are alone. And I think Nick is projecting himself into these young clerks. He's starting to realize that he is also alone and that he might be wasting these poignant moments. One of the things we're going to talk about when we get to the end of the novel is, what is Nick's feeling about Gatsby? Does he like Gatsby? Does he dislike Gatsby? People have argued for different things, but I think, as we're going to see, it's very obvious that Nick likes Gatsby and feels that Gatsby's death is a tragedy. And part of the tragedy is, at the beginning of the novel, Nick is not a romantic person. He is defiantly unromantic, as he says. He doesn't really seem to care for other people. He's very distant from other people. That starts to be challenged and changed by his friendship with Gatsby. And by the end, I think Nick becomes very kind of romantic in a very tragic way, right? He starts to see the world almost through Gatsby's eyes, and he starts to recognize the poignancy of something like lost youth. And we see that just beginning here, right after he's met Gatsby. One more paragraph here, which I think really brings this passage together. Again at 8 o'clock, when the dark lanes of the 40s were lined 5 deep with throbbing taxicabs bound for the theater district, I felt a sinking in my heart. Forms leaned together in the taxis as they waited, and voices sang, and there was laughter from unheard jokes, and lighted cigarettes made unintelligible circles inside. Imagining that I too was hurrying toward gaiety and sharing their intimate excitement, I wished them well. So what a beautiful image there, right? Just the idea of, in the dark of the city, you're standing outside and you see these taxi cabs. And what does he say? Forms leaning together in the taxi cabs. Voices singing, laughter at unheard jokes, lighted cigarettes, a series of auditory and visual images that underscore Nick's loneliness, right? He is outside these taxi cabs. He catches glimpses of the people inside, but that's all he catches. He doesn't yet know what they're laughing at. He's not in on the jokes. He's not in the taxi cabs. He's outside the taxi cabs. And again, that emphasis on loneliness. That's what this entire passage is about. Nick's kind of feelings of loneliness. And again, it's no accident that he starts to feel these things right after he's met Gatsby. Okay, moving on. The middle section of the novel is, of course, the big dramatic set piece, right, where Gatsby and Daisy reunite and meet, and it's kind of this combination of it's humorous, but it's also romantic. She cries about the shirts, right, the beautiful shirts. I want to jump, though, to the very end of the novel. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, and obviously the rise and fall of the tension throughout the middle, the way Gatsby kind of gets close to Daisy and then loses her. And those scenes have been, again, like I said, analyzed a lot. Fitzgerald, especially in that one scene that is basically chapter 7, I believe. Yeah, chapter 7. That's kind of the big set piece where they all go into the city, and it's very hot, right? It's this very hot summer, and they're drinking cocktails, and it's this very tense scene. We're not going to look at that scene specifically, but I think it's just, from a storytelling perspective, it's a wonderfully written scene because Fitzgerald is so good at building tension. That entire scene, so a few things I always say about scenes to my creative writing students. Do not skip parts of the scene just because you're bored or just because you want to jump to the interesting stuff. You have to create the simulation of real time, even if you're not literally doing real time, because to a reader, a scene is engaging and engrossing if it feels like a real-time experience. And that scene feels like a real-time experience. He writes out all the dialogue that these characters are speaking to one another. And through that dialogue, he builds and builds and builds and builds tension. Tension between Gatsby and Tom. Tension between Daisy and Gatsby and Tom. Jordan and Nick basically making little comments on the side as they watch this escalating tension. And then, of course, the tension breaks. Right? The big climactic moment at the end of that scene when Tom reveals that Gatsby was a bootlegger. That Gatsby made his money illegally selling alcohol during Prohibition, right? You have to remember the context of this novel is 1920s, right? Prohibition. And that basically destroys Gatsby's image for Daisy. But the genius of that scene, right, is not one specific line or one specific moment. It's the whole structure of it. The way Fitzgerald patiently lets the scene build, patiently writes out the dialogue and lets the tension build, escalates, and then releases it all in one moment. And I think a lot of writers struggle or fail when they get impatient about the process of building the scene. I have, unfortunately, read a lot of work by, emerging writers who they want to create a similar experience as something like that scene in Gatsby, but they keep summarizing dialogue, right? They are unwilling to write out the dialogue, even the bits of dialogue that have nothing to do with the conflict, even the bits of dialogue that's just banter. They skip that. And what happens if you skip that is you destroy what John Gardner called the fictional dream. You destroy that immersive quality that makes a scene like that so compelling. By skipping bits of dialogue, by summarizing through bits of dialogue, you fail to keep your reader engaged in the fictional moment. And the only reason a scene like that works so well is because Fitzgerald keeps us in the fictional moment. He refuses to he does not get impatient, and he does not jump ahead just to the tense moments. He understands that tension has to be built before it can be released. I want to, though, talk about the passage that comes later. So this is towards the end of chapter 8. So chapter 8 is when we get to what we sometimes might think of as the falling action, kind of moving towards the end of the novel. After Daisy and Gatsby have driven back, and after Daisy has accidentally killed Tom's mistress on the road. And this is going to be the circumstance that's going to basically set off the chain of events that leads to Gatsby's death. So there's two passages I want to look at in this chapter. The first actually has to do with Daisy. So remember, Nick's initial interest in this whole novel, Nick's initial sort of, the thing that first drew him to this entire story was witnessing Daisy's unhappiness. And so what he starts to do here is he starts to reflect and think about Daisy and Gatsby's past relationship. Now, what's interesting here, and this is where I think, some people often ask the question, is Gatsby a modernist novel? In other words, it's written at a time when modernism was the sort of literary movement of the time, but it often feels very traditional. It doesn't feel very modernist. The truth is, I would argue that the modernism of the novel, the whole idea of perspective, right, of point of view, of not so much stream of consciousness in the sense of something like Ulysses or Virginia Woolf, but this kind of idea that reality is often about, how one character might perceive it, right, or experience it. Because I think this is a way of thinking of the novel, because when we get to these later chapters, Nick is going to basically start imagining scenes that he could not have actually experienced or known. And this, I think, is where we get a little dose of modernism, right? Nick is constructing for us his idea of what Daisy is feeling and what Gatsby is feeling in the moment of his death. And I think what makes these two passages I'm about to read so compelling is that they're so beautifully written, but you have to sort of remember that they're inventions in Nick's head. He could not have actually been there, and so all he can do is imagine the reality. And I think this is, when we think about what modernism is, people often define modernism as a shift away from the sort of Victorian certainties of the 19th century, a shift away from realism into an emphasis on consciousness, right? Consciousness, and writers trying to capture consciousness. Think of Virginia Woolf, think of, Ulysses, right? Fitzgerald too, right? I think what he's doing here is he's letting us experience Nick's consciousness, his thoughts, the way his thoughts take him to imagine what someone like Daisy might feel. What Nick is essentially developing and feeling is what we call empathy. So let's look at this first paragraph. It's kind of in the middle of the chapter. It's a little section where he's imagining, again, Daisy in the past. So he's talking about this, in the context here, Daisy has, just had a little love affair with Gatsby, and he's gone off to fight in the war. And he's kind of trying to get into her head to essentially answer this question: why did she marry Tom? Why did she not remain faithful to this memory of Gatsby in the way that Gatsby remained faithful to this memory of her? And if we look at this description, he did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority and the command of the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. He was worried now. There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letters. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her, and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. At the gray tea hour, there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there, like rose petals blown by the sad horns around the floor. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men, and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately, and the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality that was close at hand. That force took shape in the middle of spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. So it's quite a sad passage, but what Fitzgerald is having Nick describe there, or imagine, is What was the process that led Daisy to decide to marry Tom instead of waiting for Gatsby? And notice what he describes. He really emphasizes the sensory experience that Daisy must have felt in her little southern town, right? So, Daisy is from Louisville, right? That's the city that's being described here. And the emphasis here is just on the sensory experience of this southern town, right? The saxophones, the orchestra, the air redolent of orchids, right? And pleasant snobbery. The word throbbed is used to describe the atmosphere. Rose petals blown by the sad horns. It's an atmosphere that's very suggestive, very sensual. And the idea seems to be that Daisy is overtaken by this atmosphere and sort of brought back into the sort of traditional patterns of the southern debutante season, right? Of the aristocratic world that she grew up in. And Gatsby, of course, outside that aristocratic world, a soldier serving in World War I, he cannot compete with the immediate sensory experiences. Now, you could ask the question, is Nick kind of judging Daisy for this? Maybe, but I think the way Fitzgerald writes it is he simply has Nick imagine what it must have been like. And so perhaps he's judging Daisy implicitly, but it's really not on the page. Instead, he seems to have almost an empathy and understanding. He seems to acknowledge that, in a context like this, in a world full of these type of sensations and possibilities, of course she would end up marrying someone like Tom Buchanan rather than waiting, right, for the romance of her youth. And so I think what he's doing here is he's trying to explain why Daisy did what she did, why she chose to marry Tom rather than wait for Gatsby. And in a way, so let's think about it from Nick's perspective. Why is he thinking about this in this moment? It's because he's trying to make sense of what's about to happen, or what has happened. The fact that Daisy is clearly not going to run away with Gatsby, that Daisy has chosen Tom over Gatsby. And Nick is trying to explain why, because at the beginning, he was convinced that Daisy was obviously so sad, so lost, so depressed, had sort of this, if you remember that opening scene, the irony with which she spoke. Now, he's sort of realizing that despite all of that, this is why she has made this decision. Now, at the end of the chapter, we have the paragraph where Gatsby is killed. And again, Nick is not there. He doesn't know what Gatsby was thinking or feeling, and yet he chooses to imagine it because he is feeling a degree of empathy that he had not felt before. And that, again, is telling us exactly how Nick is transforming over this novel. Let's look at this moment here, down at the end of chapter 8. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. And that figure, of course, is George Wilson, right? Myrtle's husband, the one who's going to murder Gatsby because he believes that Gatsby was the one who was sleeping with his wife. But notice the way that passage is written. Gatsby is kind of waiting for a telephone call, right, from Daisy, right, who, that's what he's dreaming of. But Nick chooses to imagine that maybe in this moment, Gatsby no longer believed that telephone call would come. Now, Nick can't know what Gatsby was thinking in this moment. And if anything, Gatsby was pretty defiant up until the end. He continued to believe, even after it was long over, that he still had a chance with Daisy. That, after all, was Gatsby's primary emotion, this consistency of belief in his dream. But Nick is imagining that maybe, in this final moment, Gatsby realized that the dream was dead. And look at the way it's described. He looks up at an unfamiliar sky and realizes that a rose is a grotesque thing. And he starts focusing on the details of what Gatsby must have looked at. The raw sunlight, the scarcely created grass, a world that is material but not real, with ghosts drifting around. The idea is that Gatsby no longer feels a connection to this material world. Once he realizes that maybe it's over with Daisy, he no longer finds the world romantic. He no longer finds the world beautiful. He has become disillusioned. Now, like I said, Nick could not have known that this was what Gatsby was thinking. So I think as readers, we have to conclude also this is what Nick is feeling. Nick is also experiencing this disillusionment. He is looking at the world and thinking that a rose is indeed grotesque, that the world is material but not real, that there are ghosts drifting about. It's a description of Gatsby's feelings, but it is also a description of Nick's feelings. And I think that's what's so brilliant about the way Fitzgerald structures this ending. To kind of conclude our discussion of Nick's character arc, let's look at the final chapter. So obviously, the final chapter, the action that Nick takes has to do with planning Gatsby's funeral. Kind of trying to organize Gatsby's funeral and trying to get people to show up, and realizing when people fail to show up that there's something quite tragic about Gatsby's life. Nick considers himself Gatsby's friend by the end, but no one else, any of the other people who were close to him or who came to his parties, almost no one else shows up. There's a few random kind of figures who do appear, but Nick is the one who really is there, who feels that connection. Gatsby's father shows up, but otherwise it's really just Nick and some other random people from the parties. I want to look specifically towards the very end, before after the funeral, and before the final sections of the novel, where he meets Tom one last time. Nick starts reflecting on the Midwest, on the place that he's from. So, I'm just going to read from this section. One of my most vivid memories is of coming back west from prep school, and later from college at Christmas time. Those who went farther than Chicago would gather in the old dim Union Station at 6 o'clock of a December evening, with a few Chicago friends, already caught up into their own holiday gaieties, to bid them a hasty goodbye. I remember the fur coats of the girls returning from Miss This or That's, and the chatter of frozen breath, and the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of old acquaintances and the matchings of invitations. Are you going to the Ordways, the Herseys, the Schultzes, and the long green tickets clasped tight in our gloved hands? And last, the murky yellow cars of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad looking cheerful as Christmas itself on the tracks beside the gate. So what he's doing is here, he's conjuring up a nostalgic memory of returning home to his Midwestern home from college during Christmas time, right? And remember, he went to college at Yale, so he's going back from the East Coast, back toward the Midwest. And notice how he characterizes the Midwest as this almost like warm, comforting, nostalgic social world. Not the chaotic, crazy world of New York, but something nostalgic, something comforting. And notice he uses a lot of sensory details to conjure this nostalgic feeling for us. Let's look at the next two paragraphs, which kind of bring this all together. When we pulled out into the winter night, and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp, wild brace came suddenly into the air. We drew in deep breaths of it as we walked back from dinner through the cold vestibules, unutterably aware of our identity with this country for one strange hour before we melted indistinguishably into it again. That's my Middle West, not the wheat or the prairies or the lost Swede towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth, and the street lamps and sleigh bells in the frosty dark, and the shadows of the holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. I am part of that, a little solemn with the feel of those long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway house, in a city where dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. So he ends with this beautiful nostalgic reminiscence about the significance of the Middle West to him, and he emphasizes the train journeys, what he calls the returning trains of my youth. It seems to him that for Nick, some of the happiest memories he has of the Midwest are being on that train, returning from his college on the East Coast, and being reminded that he is a person from the Midwest, right? That he is not a person from the East. And that is a very powerful feeling, this nostalgia. A lot of us feel some version of this, and maybe many of us recognize we have our own Middle West. What Nick is describing about the Midwest, we probably feel for places in our own youth and childhood. And the question we have to ask is, why is Nick telling us this now, towards the end of the novel? Why is he feeling this now? I think it's because after everything that's happened, after the tragedy of Gatsby, here, he no longer feels that the East Coast is where he wants to be. Remember, at the beginning of the novel, he was pretty excited to be moving east, to become someone in the bond business, to make money, to make it in New York. Now he seems to say, you know what, I'm done with all that. I don't want that. The life I want, the life that has meaning to me, is that nostalgia for the Midwest. That seems to be what he's interested in. And we have this, again, beautifully written lyrical passage that really, if we pay attention to the way Fitzgerald writes, there's a lot of lessons in these two paragraphs that I just read. Fitzgerald does this thing with clauses really well, where he balances his sentences really nicely. He sort of builds tension within a sentence and then releases the tension through a very careful structuring of clauses and modifiers, right? This description of the train, it begins with this series of subordinate clauses. When we pulled out into the winter night, and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by. That's all tension, tension, tension. Subordinate clauses, subordinate clauses, subordinate clauses. As the train is pulling out, how does that tension release? The next clause, a sharp, wild brace came suddenly into the air. It's a beautifully structured sentence. We talked earlier about how Fitzgerald is such a master of building and releasing tension within a scene. He does that within individual sentences as well. He creates tension using the structures of grammar, clauses and modifiers, to hold back the main clause, and then releases that tension. It's what we call a periodic sentence in writing. He also is very good at what we call cumulative sentences, where you begin with the main clause, so there's not really tension in the sentence, but you pile on detail upon detail upon detail, modifier upon modifier, until the sentence feels overwrought with passion, with beauty. That's how Fitzgerald writes, and this dynamic kind of flow between periodic and cumulative sentences creates a genuine masterpiece. And again, that's why I think, forget about Gatsby, the cultural phenomenon. Forget about the image that you see in your head from the movie. Focus on the sentences. Let the music and the rhythm of the sentences be your evidence for why this book is what it is. Let the music of the sentences convince you of the magic of this book. Okay, so I think on that note, I think that's a great place to wrap up. We're not going to talk about the ending of Gatsby here. That's a very famous passage, right? Boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. But I think this passage about the Midwest is a perfect way to conclude Nick's character arc. He has become disillusioned, right, with New York City. There is a little description in the final passage about the Dutch sailors, right, coming to New York City, seeing this harbor for the first time. That's a very famous passage at the end of Gatsby, and it is kind of beautifully written as well. And that's where Fitzgerald really brings in these thematic connections to America, right? To that sort of deeper, larger significance of Gatsby's experience. And that's obviously really important. But to kind of conclude, right, what I really wanted to emphasize with this podcast on Gatsby is not so much the stuff that everyone talks about, right? Gatsby himself, the 20s, etc. I wanted to focus on Nick's character arc, the way he transforms over the course of the novel, and on Fitzgerald's beautiful sentences. And I think if you keep your eyes on those two things, this novel will surprise you. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I think it can be tricky talking about a novel that's so famous and that has such a cultural presence. But if you ignore all the noise and all the commentary, everyone has their ideas. Oh, Gatsby's actually a bad novel. Gatsby's not worth being in the American literary canon. The truth is, people who say that, they're just trying to get a rise out of you. They're just trying to say something contrarian for the sake of it. But if you really take a look at the prose, if you really take a look at the characters, if you look at the text itself, which is what we're going to do on this podcast every week, if you look at the actual lines of text, it is impossible to argue that Gatsby is not a masterpiece. All right, so thank you all for listening. We're going to wrap up there. Next time, we're going to go back to England for a bit, and we're going to look at E.M. Forster's Howard's End. And until then, take care. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.